Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Dr. Todd Maddox, who is the CEO and founder of Cognitive Design and Statistical Consulting. His passion is to apply his 25 years of scientific and neuroscientific expertise gained by managing a large human learning, memory, and performance laboratory to help build better training solutions. He has published more than 200 scientific articles, resulting in more than 10,000 academic citations. I mean, I've had a few peer-reviewed journals, so I'm counting those, and my eyes are just going, wow. So it's so nice to have you here, Todd.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Wow. I mean, you must be constantly researching, writing, and doing all kinds of crazy brain-related activity, right?
Well, you've got to keep your brain active, to ward off the Alzheimer's, I say.
Wow. Well, you're never getting it. That's for sure. And I'm looking at what you've done. We were talking a little before we got on the air. I get some amazing people on this show from, Albert Bandura. I told you Paul Ekman's coming on, and I had Jürgen Schmidhuber, who created artificial intelligence. Just some of the brains behind some of you guys. It blows my brain just to talk to you. But I have a lot of things I want to ask you, but I first want to get a background on you, because I think, I gave a little bit of your background. I know you have a PhD in psychology and brain science, which is amazing as it is. But can you give it a little bit more of a background?
Sure. I mean, basically, after I got my PhD, I went the full academic route. So I was a university professor. I actually started at Arizona State University. So I spent some time and I love that area. There's a big part of me that wishes I never left. And then I went to the University of Texas at Austin for just under 20 years. And, this is the typical college professor teaching undergraduates, training graduate students to be scientists, and then conducting basic scientific research. And that's what I did, studying sort of how the brain learns, studying different systems in the brain that learn behavior versus learn, information, facts and figures, what kind of tools best. So sort of with technology, what technology tools are best for training information versus training behavior. Those kinds of things. And about 3 years ago, I left the academic world, the ivory towers, with this grandiose plan to convert as much of the scientific knowledge that has been gained into plain English so that people can actually utilize it. Because I realized very quickly that we've learned so much from basic science, and basic scientists have done, frankly, a really crummy job of converting that into a language that layman can understand, and that's a failure on the scientist's part, not on the layman's part.
Well, most people that would probably assume with this kind of background that you have that you would be not, you'd be that type of person that wouldn't put it into plain language. You know what I mean? How did you get to be so normal and down to earth when you have this scientific brain?
So I'll be really honest. I think it's because I'm not the smartest person that I know, and especially in academics, it was very clear to me that there were people that were a lot smarter than I was. So I always had to work harder, which was fine. I like working, but it's really helped me to take complex concepts that really smart people can talk to each other about and nobody else understands. And I'd be the one going there, sorry, I'm not too smart. Could you explain that to me better? And then I've taken that approach because look, if there is no scientific result out there that you can't put into language in terms that the quote unquote average person can understand. Are you going to miss some nuance? Of course you're going to miss some nuance, and nuance is important, but you should be able to get across the basics of your idea in a few sentences using regular plain English without a bunch of jargon.
You know, my first exposure to peer-reviewed journal articles was as a pharmaceutical rep. I was in AstraZeneca for like 15 years of pharmaceutical, 20 years with the company. And, you know, I remember reading these things going, what? You know, as you're starting.
Yeah.
And all the statistical analysis is what was a lot of fun. But I think that a lot of people think that if you write in a way that's all snooty sounding, that is somehow more impressive. I love it when people write in a more down-to-earth way that you kind of could just relate and understand. I don't think it's necessary to make it be so complicated. And I love that you're trying to do that.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think so, you know, full disclosure, I think you need both. I think scientific journals, peer-reviewed scientific journals where the audience are other scientists,
right.
You have to put all that rigor in there. I mean, for one, you won't get published if you don't.
Right.
You know, but you know, that doesn't mean that that's the only audience you should communicate to. And in fact, what I've learned really, really quickly in the last few years is there are a lot of people out there that are eager, passionate to understand this stuff. They just want you to speak to them in their language, in English, you know, not in some jargony scientific language talking about p-values. They just want to know what works.
Yeah, I hear you, and I want to put some couple things into more easier ways of looking at it. I know I've done work with curiosity, and a lot of people are very interested in that because I think we found a lot of the things that people I've had on my show who have researched creativity and motivation. We all kept coming back to like curiosity is the spark that drives all these other things. Have you researched curiosity at all? Because you talked a little before we got on the air that you had a couple thoughts about that. I was curious what you were thinking about discussing today.
Yeah. I cannot say that I've ever published a peer-reviewed article where, you know, I used that term curiosity, but I started thinking about this a little bit more actually when we first connected with each other. And I think if we take the term curiosity and we talk about at least a component of it that I'll call creativity, maybe even you know, what people talk about thinking outside the box. People talk about in the scientific literature, they talk about cognitive flexibility. So if we want to argue that curiosity, some components of curiosity are thinking outside the box, being creative, then I think I do have a few things to say about that. Again, all from sort of where does this sort of emerge in the brain? Yeah. What are some of the interesting phenomena?
Please.
Cool. Okay, so I'll say a few things about that. First, maybe just a little bit of background on neuroscience. So, and in particular, and learning and these kinds of things. Is curiosity, creativity, thinking outside the box are really important for learning, problem solving, and decision making. Most of that occurs, at least directly, in what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is an area of brain right behind your forehead. When you, so working memory is important. There used to be a time way back when somebody would give you their phone number on a piece of paper and you would try to memorize it. We don't do that anymore. Right. But, you know, you'd memorize it by rehearsing it mentally to yourself. That's using working memory, saying those 7 numbers over and over again until eventually it's stored in long-term memory and you don't have to keep rehearsing it. It's just there. So the relevant brain regions are this prefrontal cortex. I call it the cognitive learning system. There's some really, really cool research that has shown that when you're in a good mood, when you're in a positive mood, and this can either be just in your daily life, you're just feeling better right now for whatever reason, or if somebody maybe pays you a compliment or gives you a small gift, what happens is you get release of the neurotransmitter dopamine into the prefrontal cortex, and it enhances things like creativity. It enhances your ability to think outside the box. And there's very rigorous peer-reviewed scientific work on this, much of it conducted at Cornell by a woman named Alice Eisen, who unfortunately has passed away. But what's kind of cool about this is dopamine that's released into the prefrontal cortex that helps you, that sort of enhances your curiosity because of the mood component. This is actually elicited in very subcortical regions. These are the, when when, the analogy I use is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean,
Uh-huh.
everybody knows sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's about feeling good. Well,
Right.
dopamine's about feeling good. So I think that's one thing you can actually enhance. You'll on average, you'll be more curious, you'll be more creative when you're in a positive mood, which I think is pretty interesting. Now, sort of along those same lines, I'll say one more thing, and then sort of we can move on to something else. A couple of days ago, I was at a trade show for a learning and development company, and the keynote was Daniel Pink.
Yeah.
And I knew about his work, but I hadn't, to be honest, hadn't read any of it.
Oh, really? He's good, yeah.
He is good. I just read Drive, and what he presented on though was this topic called when. And I haven't gone back to the primary literature. I'm sure, he sort of glossed over nuance, which is exactly what you should do to talk
Right.
normal. But he showed that our moods fluctuates over the day, just regardless of what's going on.
Kind of like
You
a
actually
circadian rhythm or something.
so what he didn't do was talk about sort of what drives this, right? Where, what's the causal factor? And I think that's from a neurochemical standpoint, I think that's super interesting.
Right.
But you sort of start off the morning pretty positive in a good mood around noonish, and of course there's lots of individual differences, but you start tanking, and then it picks back up again in the afternoon. And one thing that he suggested was that it's in the afternoon when you should do your sort of creative work, because you've got this big boost. You've come out of this trough, you've got this big boost of mood. Your mood is up, quite a bit up actually, and so mood being up, dopamine release into prefrontal cortex, you're going to be more creative. You're going to be thinking outside the box more. You're going to be curious about things. So I thought that's something I didn't know before, but I found really interesting.
Well, it'd be interesting to me to research, because I feel like I'm the exact opposite. I'm kind of toast after lunch. It's like, I don't know how much creativity I have in the afternoon, but I wonder if it's, I'm sure everybody's got their unique differences of when they think the best. And I wonder if he's a night owl and it fits him better.
Right. So he did make that. So I'll make one clarification. So absolutely, you tank afternoon. It's really about like 5 or 6 in the afternoon where you get that big boost and you're more creative. But he did make the distinction between what are called larks and owls.
Oh yeah.
Morning people, afternoon people. So
that's great. He is interesting, and for me, afternoon ends like at 2:00. So when I hit 5:00, I'm like getting ready for bed. I
hear you.
I'm so fun at night, but it's an interesting perspective, and I've seen his lark and owl thing, and I love to watch him talk. He's amazing.
They're really good.
And I'm curious about. We talked about curiosity and the parts of the brain. You talked about, for the prefrontal cortex and all that. And I want to talk to you a little bit about perception. How do you look at what would your definition of perception be? And is that the same part of the brain? And can you talk a little to perception? Because
sure,
I think it's an interesting thing in the working world, because we got to work with so many different cultures, so many different people, and how we see things. They say perception's reality and all that. I just want to get your insight.
Sure. So that's a great topic. So here's the way I look at it. So we're a human being. We're in our environment. The environment is stimulating all of our senses. That's what's called the sensory input. So when I look at something, photons of light are entering my eye. They're going into the retina, which is at the back of the eye. They're stimulating rods and cones, and I start to see color, right? And basically, in the human being, everything that we see is a mixture of red, green, and blue, because we only have receptors for red, green, and blue. That doesn't mean that there aren't other wavelengths out there, right? And we know that there are. There are plenty of wavelengths that we can't see. So I think the first point is that there's a lot of sensory input that's coming in to the human brain via our auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory senses. but only a certain amount of that is actually perceived, that is processed at some level so that it influences brain activation, right? A lot of it's outside of that perceived range, and it's basically doing, it's still hitting our system, but it's
Right.
doing nothing to the brain. So that's one level, but then there's a level beyond that, and I think this is the level that you're really talking about, and that is how much of what we quote unquote perceive is available to conscious awareness, and that we actually act on it volitionally, and that's a lot smaller part of sort of things that come in and affect our brain. Because, and this is a theory, I don't know that it's been validated, but there's a lot of people that buy into this. There's a theory that says you are only consciously aware of processing in your brain. So you are only consciously aware, you only know that something's going on in brain regions that project directly to the prefrontal cortex. And we talked a little bit about the prefrontal cortex before. In other words, consciousness, what you're conscious of, is processing in brain regions that project directly to the prefrontal cortex. Well, there's a lot of brain regions that do a lot of processing that don't project directly to the prefrontal cortex, and thus we are not consciously aware of them. They influence our behavior, so they influence the way we interact with the world, but we're not consciously aware of it at all.
Can you give
an
example of that? That's interesting.
Well, so this is actually a great transition point to the Ekman stuff that we talked about.
Talk about that. Yeah.
Okay, so Ekman did some classic work on basically categorizing facial expressions. The idea is, if I'm sad, you can actually see that on my face. If I'm happy, you can see it on my face. And Paul Ekman was a scientist. What he did was he went and said, I am going to break down basically the way the muscles on the face are adjusted, because the face has a ton of musculature. I'm going to literally categorize those. If the outside of your mouth is curved up, that's I think it was actually a 9 in the Ekman system. I learned this back in the late 80s. I actually was able to manually code this stuff.
Wow.
So he was able to then take a look at a face, categorize its emotion, and then utilize that to, in science. But here's what's cool about this. What drives those changes in the muscles in your face, a lot of that is not available to conscious awareness. In other words, so I might say to somebody, "Oh, that was really cool," but I'm rolling my eyes. I'm not making eye contact. Right? I mean, it's like, okay, yeah, right, because actions speak louder than words. That's one of my favorite lines. Actions speak louder than words. I can say to somebody, "Oh, I'm really sorry about that," but if I'm not showing that on my face, they're not going to believe me.
Right.
And it's really hard. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very difficult to consciously control your facial expression. You really have to work at it and train, and most people don't. And so what's happening is that their facial expressions are sort of outing them. It's what they really feel. Yeah. Right? And so that comes back to sort of the perception. I might in my head think, "Oh, but I just told them I was sorry," but I didn't, because my facial expression said I wasn't. and that's what they processed. And you weren't sorry, and the problem's not resolved.
Well, it's an interesting talk about the nature and nurture when I was looking at some of this stuff, because he was, I don't know if it was where I read, but that if you were blind from birth, you still made those same expressions.
Yeah.
Which is so fascinating to me.
It is.
It's not a learned thing.
No.
And so, but then it ties into, when we look at the same situation, say we're all in a working world and we're all looking at the same thing, we yet perceive things differently sometimes. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that is the real, it's an absolutely fascinating topic. So, we all perceive things within our frame of reference. And one of the hardest things to do, and actually this is to me, this is probably the number one problem right now in corporate America. And that is things like empathy, sympathy, compassion, an ability to really understand where somebody else is coming from. I mean, I don't want to get political, but there are certain political figures that have none of that.
Yeah.
And whereas let's say you do and I do, we might look at the same thing. I don't know, a small child being taken or ripped away from their parent, and you and I might tear up and just feel terrible, and that other individual feels nothing. Okay, so how can that be, right? It's the same situation.
Right.
We're viewing the same exact situation, but what perception is, so perception is a representation of the real world by the individual. And the truth of the matter is that everybody perceives the world differently. Now, that's great. Diversity is great. I mean, diversity is awesome. It's great for innovation.
Right.
All these kinds of things.
Very boring without it. Right.
It would be incredibly boring without it. And we've seen lots of movies like that where everybody's just kind of a robot.
Right.
But what you have to have along with that, you have to embrace that diversity. You have to, you don't have to be exactly like somebody else, but you have to say, you know what, I empathize with you, or even worst case, I'm going to agree to disagree. Let's see what common ground we can find and move forward. So, and I will say, all of the, most interactions used to be face to face.
Right.
Now everything's either, it's web based or it's phone, or you got conference calls, and we are missing out. I mean, dovetail back to Ekman, we are missing out on so much communication, which is the body language.
Yeah. Body
language says it all.
Well, so then is perception reality? People argue that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so, I mean, it's my reality, right? What I perceive is my reality. I mean, when I look at, I used to teach perception to undergrads, and the best way to teach perception is to show them these optical illusions.
Oh yeah. Cool.
Yeah, they're really cool, and people go, oh, why? I mean, oh, that's weird. I mean, why would the brain be misleading me like that? Well, the eye, the information that hits the eye is two-dimensional. Now we have two eyes, and so that's how we see a 3D world.
Right.
But you know what? The world might not be 3D.
What is it?
It may just have to do with the way that the way that we're designed and that we perceive it. So I mean, perception is very real for each of us. But I think we always have to realize that other people's perception of the same thing might be different, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong.
And that's what I'd like to get companies and organizations to embrace, because we talk about cultural quotients and having a cultural awareness. If you do business in other countries, or other countries want to do business with the United States, what do you think are the biggest impactors to our perception of how we're going to get along together?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to. It really comes down again to that ability to respect another person's way of looking at things, trying to find common ground, empathizing with somebody else. And what's really interesting about this, and this sort of comes back to some of the neuroscience stuff. So let's just take Me Too, for example. Let's just put this right out on the table, because This is something that's passionate for me. Okay. And actually, when the Weinstein thing hit, I just about blew up and wrote a few pieces on this. But we have been providing harassment training. I mean, I know as a university professor, I did it every year, and it was text telling me what defining harassment, telling me maybe what a bias is. Maybe I see a video of an example of it. It's usually a terrible, cheesy video. Yeah. So I'm being provided with information about what this is. But guess what? Harassment's not information. Harassment's behavior.
Right.
Harassment is people behaving inappropriately with somebody else. Well, the behavioral system the behavioral learning systems in the brain are completely distinct from the definitional processing systems in the brain. And they're not even all that connected. In fact, they're competitive. So you teach me all these definitions about harassment, and I go, oh, yeah, I got that. And then I go out and I commit the behaviors instead. So what we really need to do is start training those behaviors. Well, training behavior directly is very challenging. Technologies like virtual reality are actually a great technology. We're getting really close to, in fact, there's a woman in LA who has a pretty amazing VR harassment training platform right now. So, we're getting there, but what we've been doing is we've been training the wrong part of the brain and then wondering why nothing's getting better.
Okay, what's the wrong part? What's the right part?
Okay, so the wrong part. So again, harassment is about behavior.
Right. So
it's about
what part of the brain is that?
That is what's called the big structure is called the basal ganglia. The smaller sort of subcomponent is what's called the striatum. And this is so. Is
that in the limbic system?
It's in the limbic system.
Okay.
This is where the dopamine release occurs. These are part of the reward centers. It gets a little more complicated than that. So I want to get that out front that I'm not I am oversimplifying, but I know what I'm talking about, I guess. But it's those systems. So I think one of the best analogies is sports. I can read every book that there is on how to, putt a golf ball. Yeah. I can recite Bible and verse, right? This chapter. Okay. But that doesn't mean I can hit a golf ball. The only way to learn how to hit a golf ball and putt is to go putt. And in fact, when you're learning how to putt, which I never have, but when you're out learning about it, teachers will tell you, don't overthink it.
Yeah.
Don't overthink it. Well, what that means is don't use the prefrontal cortex. That's your thinking part. That's the rules and regulations, the definition of harassment. Don't use that. Just go with the flow, generate a response. You're going to get feedback. You're going to get dopamine release if you did the right thing. You're not going to get dopamine release if you did the wrong thing. And you're going to gradually and incrementally get better. That's the system that we need to be targeting.
Yeah.
And we're not.
Why aren't we?
Well, we aren't because it's really hard to do that. It's certainly hard to do that at scale. Well, okay, actually, there's two reasons.
Okay.
The first reason is none of these people know anything about how the brain works.
Right.
So I mean, we definitely, and I mean as our society, but certainly even in diversity and inclusion, harassment training, unconscious bias training, we have this belief that you learn through the cognitive system. That is, you learn by throwing information at people. That's not how you learn behavior. You learn behavior by having people generate behaviors and get immediate feedback on that behavior. So actually the best way to train for harassment would be, the scalable way would be with tools like virtual reality. I go in virtual reality. In fact, this would be perfect. I'm a middle-aged heterosexual white guy. Put me in virtual reality, and I look at my arms, and I'm a young African-American lesbian. Okay?
Yeah, okay.
So, wow. Okay, first thing is, oh, wow, I'm a young African-American lesbian. I am somebody else.
Right.
Emotion centers in my brain are going to light up. It's visceral. It's an empathy builder.
Right.
So right there, I've already gotten value. Now, how about some guy walks by and makes some inappropriate comment? Whoa, I've just learned something from that.
Right.
Big time. Or put it another way. Let's say that I go into VR and I'm a guy. I'm essentially me, and maybe I say something inappropriate, and I get slapped in the face. Okay, that's a punishment. I'm going to be less likely to generate that behavior if I'm put in that context again. On the other hand, what if I say the appropriate thing, behave appropriately? I get a smile, how you doing? I've just gotten rewarded. Right. Now that behavior pattern gets rewarded. So the real key is training behavior. It's hard to do at scale with e-learning type approaches.
Yeah.
We really want to trade behavior directly. So it's tough.
There's so many things I want to ask you. I go through this. I'm like, I want to ask him about. I wrote my dissertation on emotional intelligence. So you talk about empathy.
Okay.
And that I'm thinking about that. I'm curious about your idea of perception of the Gillette commercial. But let's start with the emotional intelligence aspect. You hear the story of Phineas Gage and getting the post through his brain, and they found
I
don't know if you want to tell a little of that story, but I was wondering if you had any other cool stories that show about how maybe where perception is in the brain, if it's at the same area as what we found with emotional intelligence, and are any other stories that are kind of like the Phineas Gage thing where you found out this is cool how we found out.
Yeah, sure. So actually the HM story is interesting, and again, a quick disclaimer that I have a PhD in psychology level understanding of HM, which means I don't know as much as a lot of people do. But my understanding of HM, Phineas Gage. I'm sorry, HM is the amnestic. Phineas Gage. My understanding is that he was a factory worker or something. There, I don't know, something blew up.
Yeah, in the railroad.
And a rod went through his prefrontal cortex. Okay, so what happened was, this is at least the theory, and it makes a lot of sense, is what happened was he lost inhibitory control. So he lost, and you actually see this, in Alzheimer's as well, which is pretty interesting. So actually let's take a quick step back. In the end, we're all biological organisms with needs and urges. We say things in our head all the time that we might want to say or do to somebody, and we stop ourselves because it's not appropriate.
Right.
Okay? That's called inhibitory control. Right? So inhibitory control is actually in the prefrontal cortex. And so what happened with Phineas Gage was that inhibitory control was gone. And so he started, all that inappropriate stuff that everybody or a lot of people think about but don't act on. He had nothing to stop him, and so he kept acting on it. Now, where do those inappropriate behaviors come from? They don't come from the prefrontal cortex. They come from emotional centers, and I think that's when you're talking about emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. What you're really talking about is, the amygdala and these other limbic structures that drive emotional processing, and those tend to be more subcortical structures. So it's again, now I'm talking about cognitive areas and emotional areas, and talking about how they interact. Well, and they do. We spend a lot of time inhibiting actions that our society, starting with our parents, taught us this is not appropriate. You don't do that. But that was gone. And you definitely see it in senior living facilities, especially in the memory care. Uh-huh. You'll see people just, people ripping their clothes off. And this isn't just men, it's men and women. Mm-hmm. So all that inhibitory control is gone. And a big part of that is because these inhibitory centers they're not working anymore, and so people are acting out.
Is that the same part of the brain that is impacted with perception as well?
The way I view perception is much broader, because perception is driven by sensory information, and sensory information comes in 5 forms, right? Mm-hmm. Sight, sound, all that, and vision is processed in the back of the brain, which is the occipital lobes. Auditory information is processed in the temporal lobes on the side of the brain. Olfactory is sort of deeper down, subcortical. There's actually the olfactory bulb. So perception is much more broadly distributed.
Right.
And this is really overgeneralizing, but you can think of perceptual processing being broadly distributed in the brain. Everything then sort of goes through what's called the thalamus. And you can think of the thalamus like in Phoenix, that's Southwest hub. Everything goes through Phoenix on Southwest. Right. Okay. So that's the thalamus.
Okay.
And then it goes from there, and and then either you're learning behavior, maybe you're learning information, maybe there's informational processing. So it goes from sort of more diffuse processing, which gets you the perception, processes the environment you're in. That then feeds through the thalamus, and then it goes out to where you're getting something done. You're either learning information, you're generating behaviors, you're feeling emotional, and of course the interactions of all those.
So this is really interesting because it's bringing me back when I interviewed Jürgen Schmidhuber. We talked about how they were creating artificial curiosity, and I know I'm curious, can we create any kind of artificial perception? And what's since you're
that's what LSD is. That's what LSD does. That's what psilocybin does. That's what pot does. That's what I mean. For that matter, that's what alcohol does, right? I mean, the artificial perception that you feel more confident. I think. I mean, I would say especially, and I'm not going to say what I know from experience or don't, but I will say that the quote unquote psychoactive drugs. They definitely alter what you would think of as perception. You kind of, you see things in a different light. Like for real, you see things in a different light. Ecstasy, same thing. Other drugs like, alcohol is basically a depressant. So sure, you feel a little more confident. You're not as inhibited, but it doesn't change it doesn't really change how you see things or hear things, of course, until you get so drunk that you're seeing double. And the cocaine and uppers and that. I mean, so it's really the psychoactive drugs that absolutely alter perception.
Well, what about like in the computer world? Like if we're creating like an artificial intelligence that's curious, and can you alter the perception of computers if they're, if there's a reality, if they all have the same senses?
Boy,
is that alterable, or are they all going
to? That's a great question. Here, I guess I'll what will I say on that? So 30 plus years ago, when I started graduate school in psychology and neuroscience, I talked to computer scientists and such, and they told us that they basically have AI replacing human beings within a couple of years. Mm-hmm. It's not even here now. And my personal opinion, and this is my semi-informed opinion, but I think it's decent because of the way the brain works. AI is going to be really good at solving basically step-by-step types of instructions, things that you can really easily capture in computer code. Whether that's gonna like lead to consciousness, I'm skeptical. I'm really skeptical of that because we don't even know what consciousness really is in the human being. Do we really think it's going to emerge in the computer? I will say that one thing that I think people are missing, and as I mentioned, I left academics about 3 years ago. I knew the words AI. I knew artificial intelligence. I knew machine learning. I come into the corporate sector, and I've never been bombarded with those words more than, and most of it's not real. It's people just using buzzwords. Correlation is not machine learning. It's correlation. And if you drill down into a lot of these applications, that's what they are. Now, that's not Google. That's not Facebook. Those guys are for real doing really good stuff. But I think the way to go about this, as opposed to the current methodology, which is computer scientists and engineers drive the bus. Well, they're the ones that know how to code. They're the ones that know the complex math. I get it. That's all great. But guess what? The best machine out there is still the human being. It's the most amazing. Sure, I know it has flaws. It has limitations. But all in all, it does everything quite well. And a lot of computers do one thing really well and can't do anything else. So the way I would approach it would be to model what the human does, model how the brain works, and the prefrontal cortex works differently from the striatum. So model those with different machine learning algorithms, put them together in the way that the brain puts them together. Now you might start to get emergent perceptions and emergent personalities.
Mm-hmm.
But I am not convinced that that's gonna happen with the way things are being done now. But
Well, that's interesting. I'm curious what you think is the most misunderstood aspect of brain science in general. I mean, of what do we have a lot of misconceptions of what we can and can't control just in our own brain?
yeah, I think we do. I cover the learning and development, corporate learning and development sector a lot. I mean, the technologies out there are just amazing, but they are all of them are prefrontal cortex centric. They're all just engaging the prefrontal cortex because people think that that's how you get information into the brain. Yeah, that's how you get facts and figures into the brain, but that's not how you train behavior. And every L&D, corporate L&D vendor, their tagline is, we change behavior. Well, you're not changing behavior if you're targeting the prefrontal cortex. And so actions speak louder than words. I can know what to do, but I might not do it, right? I know not to eat that piece of chocolate, but I do anyway, right? So knowing what and knowing how are completely different things. And we talk about willpower. Well, it's just willpower. No, it's not. Willpower is a tiny little part of your brain. I mean, if you want to change, if you want to stop somebody from using heroin, willpower is not going to work.
So
that's not the way to do it. Well, you need to identify the brain regions where that's involved. So that requires neuroscience research.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to go in there and you need to modify those behaviors. You need to modify those behaviors. It's going to be gradual. It's going to be incremental. I mean, that's right. That's right. I mean, take rehab, traditional rehab.
Right.
Okay. So, I'm a junkie. I go to rehab. I don't use for 2 months. I feel great. I'm so glad I'm not using. I go back into my environment and I fall off the horse. I mean, that's what happens. I don't know, 80% of the time. It's a really high number.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is that? I know why that is. Because it's called contextual learning. My behaviors in this environment are using. I go to this other environment, completely different context. I don't use, but my brain, when I'm in rehab, my brain says, I know what you're doing. You put me in a new context. I'm gonna save those behaviors that I had before because they felt good. And then when you go back into that environment, you start using again. So what we need to do, like in rehab, and this is actually another application of virtual reality, put somebody in rehab, put them in VR, and they're in VR in a very similar environment to where they were using. A lot of the same cues are present, but don't reward that environment. Don't provide the reinforcement. What you're going to start doing is you're going to get what's called unlearning. And that's the key. You want to unlearn the bad behaviors, not just learn new good behaviors. You've got to unlearn the bad behaviors. So again, that's where, we're not paying enough attention to the behavioral side. We're focused way too much on the information side.
Well, okay, so we talk about augmented and virtual reality to disrupt corporate learning and all the things that we want to do with that. And this is, or your example with the heroin or different things to get people in this immersive kind of thing. How can we use this with cultural immersion? I just actually this morning, before I talked to you, had a CEO of a company where they kind of immerse you in the making of different foods and different cultures through the internet. You're actually have the chef in there, the video, and you're right there, and and it's to get that experience. So would like to know, in the business sense, if you wanted to do business with another culture, how can we get that immersive experience, maybe to help our perceptions to get along better? Yeah,
I mean, and I think, and this is why. And for the record, I have no stock in any VR companies, but this is why I believe VR. So again, okay. I'm a simple-minded guy. What I do is I look at a technology and I say, how is that technology affecting the way the brain processes information? So a traditional e-learning experience, looking at your mobile device, even watching a video. What brain regions does it engage? Well, let's just take watching a video. So let's say your company partners with people in India and China and the Middle East. And we know there's big cultural differences there. Oh, well, so I could watch some videos, right? I could watch some videos that not only tell me about the culture, that's information, but is also sort of giving me visually and in an auditory sense a little bit of sort of how that culture works. Okay, so I'm engaging those sensory systems we talked about,
right,
and I'm engaging some of that perception. Okay, that's great. But when I turn my head, that screen didn't move. Right? When I turn around, I don't see it anymore.
Right.
Okay, this is what VR does. So when you put VR on, you put a VR headset on, you put the headphones on, you are immediately transported into that environment. In fact, I mean, you could be transported on top of the Empire State Building and be told to walk a plank, and people won't do it because even though they know they're in a room, they won't do it. Why won't they do it? Because this massively engages what I call experiential systems. Yeah, the perceptual systems in the brain. And when you turn your head, the environment moves exactly like it does in the real world. So for these kinds of cultural exchange, basically trying to understand another culture, the best way to do that is to be immersed in it. Obviously, the content needs to be good. The discussion needs to be good. The situations you're put in can be optimized. Just plopping somebody in China doesn't do anything, but you want to be presented with these corporate cultural differences and learn how to deal with it. But because you're engaging more of the brain, what I call in synchrony, so all these brain regions are active together, you get a much more powerful experience. Actually, to your comment about EQ, one of the main sets of regions that are activated are these emotional regions. Because whoa, where am I? Well, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And so it's going to, those brain systems are activated. You can do things like walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, right? I could be somebody in China, literally, being treated disrespectfully by a Caucasian person. Right. So it's like, oh, I see my behavior that I think is just normal because it's normal where I live, actually offended that person. But how do I know that? Because I was actually that person for a second.
Now, is this available, this kind of virtual reality software, or you're talking about in the future?
No,
Got to get a Star Trek holodeck or what?
No, and that's what's cool. I mean, so the number of use cases I believe is infinite. The vendors that are providing these solutions, the numbers are growing. There's certainly people in corporate, and now there's a lot of nuance. There's computer graphics-based VR. There's what's called 360 video VR. There's interactive VR where you actually can move your hands around and you can see them in the space. There's VR where you just have a headset on. But yeah, solutions are out there. They're growing and they're developing. The real problem is they're not embracing the neuroscience. And so they're building tools that, right? So who are the developers here? Gamers.
Yeah.
Nothing against gamers, but you need neuroscientists. So, that's actually one of the things that I do a fair amount of is consult with these kinds of companies and say, you've got this disruptive technology, but you're not using it in the optimal way. Well, what do you mean? Well, you're not engaging the brains in this way. That's what you want, right? Here's what you want, but you're not engaging those parts of the brain. Here's what you need to do to engage those. So yeah, it's here. It's here to stay. Healthcare is a sector where this is absolutely exploding, and I'm thrilled about that because we have so many healthcare crises of training, education, empathy, reducing people's anxiety, enhancing satisfaction. But corporate, industrial manufacturing, you name it. It's retail, marketing. This stuff is taken off.
I looked at one of your articles about that, medical not having cadavers anymore. It's just fascinating.
It is.
My husband's a plastic surgeon, and he had to go through so much training. Reality training. And of course you want that, but what's the advantage of using these 3D virtual reality type of trainings for doctors?
Yeah. So I mean, a couple of things. First, I'll bet you, if you really grilled your husband, he'd say, you know what? I got a lot of training, but I got to be honest, on that first day, I still didn't feel totally prepared.
Yeah.
And because you need, so he's a plastic surgeon. He has a behavioral skill that's off the charts. Okay. His behavioral repertoire is absolutely superior. To train behavior, you need thousands of hours. What's happening in our current medical field, let's take in the emergency room. That's where doctors learn. Do I want a doctor to learn, on my family, my parents, myself?
Yeah.
No. Okay. So what virtual reality allows us to do is get that practice that currently MDs are getting in cadaver labs, or simulate, or getting in the ER. You can get an infinite amount of that in VR. That's one point that's super important. The second point is that in traditional training, you're trained how to, let's say, deliver a baby. You do it if you're lucky to get any sort of practice at it. You're going to get practice at it when you have all the tools that you need. Wouldn't it be nice to know how to deliver the baby in the back of a cab without all the tools that you need, because people have done it? Well, you could get that training in VR. You could get that training in VR, and it's not going to cost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. You can train people on events that are super unlikely to occur, right? I mean, the baby in the back of the cab is unlikely, but things that are even more unlikely, you can throw the book at them, just throw all this crazy stuff happening and see how well they do. So it engages the brain in the way that you want, super effectively. It's time effective, it's cost effective, and it's scalable. And to me, that's the triple whammy. You have that in a field like medicine.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Well,
yeah.
It brings to mind then the Matrix, like,
Mm-hmm.
you can't exactly upload to your brain because it's not experiential, whatever. It's not immersive, I should say. And you're having a hard time. You're just throwing a book at somebody if you're uploading the knowledge, right? So
right.
The Matrix won't work, right?
Well, but it's interesting, right? Because the Matrix. They talk about
it wouldn't work, but maybe
I think that's actually really interesting. Okay, so. Yeah. For those movies like that, again, they're just like everybody else. They think that the only thing that you teach people is information. But why couldn't you? I don't see that. Even uploading somebody information is massively changing the way the brain is organized. When you learn information and you rehearse it mentally and you store it in long-term memory, those are chemical changes to literally brain cells. Well, if you can do that, you can probably do it in the striatum. You can probably upload all the motor programs that somebody needs to be, Shaquille O'Neal or whoever, be a great athlete. Now the algorithms are going to be different. The neurochemistry is going to be different. The way you upload it is probably going to be totally different. But both of those are just as challenging, but people, again, tend to fixate on cognitive stuff and think that that's all that we learn. And frankly, that's the least interesting part of what we learn.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious if you would take the blue pill or the red pill in Matrix. If the blue pill, the story ends and you figure out, no one tells you, that what you're seeing isn't reality, or would you take the red pill and go down the rabbit hole and try to figure out the truth?
I'm a scientist, so that I would always go that route.
You'd go red pill. Okay. I kind of figured that. So.
Yeah, I can't be oblivious. I gotta know.
I gotta know too, and I wanted to know so much. I couldn't wait to talk to you today. This has been so much fun, Todd. You are so interesting. I could ask you questions for hours, and I appreciate you just answering all these really interesting things. And I think a lot of companies probably want to know how they could reach you, because I'm sure your consulting business and all the stuff you do to help businesses with disrupting their corporate learning would be really helpul. And everything else you do, how can people reach you?
It's pretty funny. I'm going to be really honest here publicly that I am a one-man shop. So it's my Gmail account, which is WTODDMADDOX. So a W in front of Todd Maddox. My first name is William, and I don't like it, but I kept the W. At gmail.com. That's the best way to get a hold of me. I am passionate about this, and I do want to have some kind of a positive impact on the world. So
Well,
I'm
this
all
is
game.
great. You really are very and interesting, and I could listen to all this for hours. This is so fascinating. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, thank you for asking me sincerely. It's been a pleasure, really fun time, and I'm energized. I've got my mood up, and I'm ready to
That's right.
get back to work.
I am too, and we'll be back right after this message.